Welcome to Perception and Cognition. I felt a good place to begin was to tackle the two concepts in the name of this class and question how they're related to each other. Thus, our initial questions are going to be: how have psychologists understood and studied perception and cognition? What do we mean by those terms? And how are they related? We'll consider both historical and contemporary positions on these questions throughout this semester. To begin, let's consider which branch of psychology studies these topics. We're situated in the field called cognitive psychology, which studies, among other things, attention, problem-solving, intelligence, language, and perception. If we consider how these topics are organized in a Gen Psych textbook, and I've pulled just two examples here, most are going to have a separate chapter on perception that's sometimes combined with sensation, while the other cognitive topics, often called higher order cognition, are spread around and or grouped together in a single chapter, but never combined with perception. Thus, we should ask ourselves, what is perception and how is it related to cognition? Furthermore, why is perception tied to sensation, and what is the difference between these two? We'll tackle the first question on the relationship between perception and cognition, and we'll discuss the question of sensation and perception later on in the course. So let's begin with our initial question. How are perception and cognition related? Are they independent of each other? Is it possible to have perception without cognition and vice versa? The first reading we start with is based on a symposium presentation by Michel in the 2019 International Convention of Psychological Science, where she discusses this very question. She begins her remarks with the premise that because psychology textbooks have separate chapters on perception and higher level cognitive processes such as intelligence, learning, and memory, that this necessarily means that they are and have been viewed as separate and distinct, but then goes on to argue in her remarks that they are not. But this premise seems faulty. Just because we can distinguish between them doesn't mean that they're not related to each other. If we take a look again at the organization of the textbook, let's consider two examples. The first is the division between sensation and perception, sometimes separate chapters, other times grouped together. Regardless of the number of chapters, sensation and perception have long been thought of as separate, whereby sensation happens first and perception follows. Thus, perception depends on sensation, but sensation is a separate, distinct, independent process. We'll discuss this further and critique this notion later on in the semester. The second example is learning and memory, which are separate chapters, but all learning entails some form of remembering. If you don't remember what you learned, have you learned it? No one seems to be arguing that learning and memory are independent despite there being two separate chapters. So this seems like a weak support for her argument that they have always been seen as separate. So while her premise, in my opinion, is a bit overstated, it's also difficult to find support for her premise as well historically. No major thinker or school of thought has implied or stated that perception and cognition are independent processes. There are recent trends that advocate for this, however, it's a very recent development. So if perception is not independent of cognition, they must be dependent, but how so? There are three main answers to this question. The first is that perception is cognition. There is no distinction between them, which is what Michel argues in her remarks. The second is that perception depends on cognition. That is, without cognition, there would be no perception. And the third answer has been that cognition begins with perception. That is, without perception, there would be no cognition. Now, if we take a closer look at these last two positions, we have the assumption that there is a one-way directional causal arrow. Perception is considered to be a lower-level cognitive process that then enables or informs higher-order cognitive processes. But is this the case? Does our perception of objects, the world, others, even ourselves, have no influence from past experiences? Does so-called lower-level perception happen first without any influence from higher-level cognitive processing? In other words, only via bottom-up processing? Is top-down processing even possible? Let's take a closer look at the studies that Michel cites in her article. The first evidence Michel cites is from neuroimaging studies. Indeed, cognitive neuroscience is a burgeoning field growing with advances in brain imaging capabilities. However, we should be clear about what in fact we're actually observing. Brain correlates should not be confused with the psychological processes themselves. Indeed, they do show, quote, both when and where visual perception occurs in the brain, end quote, but our brains are just one part of our bodies, and our bodies are embedded in a world. This separation of person from world will come up again and again throughout this class. The cognitive neuroside overemphasizes the person side of the equation, while the other sides that we'll read, including Gibson, another theorist, overemphasizes the world side of the equation. So given this, what do these studies tell us? They inform us about the inner workings of the brain. In short, the physical components that are necessary but not sufficient for the psychological processes being observed. It is thought to be surprising that the ability to classify an object, which is considered to be a higher order cognitive process, is engaged pretty soon after recognizing the object and perceiving its shape or color, which are lower order processes. The assumption here is that a lower order process must precede any higher level thought process. The assumption has long been that lower order must be engaged first, which then informs any higher order process. So the fact that higher order, that is the ability to classify an object, is pretty quickly engaged following lower order ones suggests that this order of processing may not be correct. Can higher order happen without lower level engagement? And further, can higher order inform, shape, and even influence lower level processing? Let's test this for ourselves. If I were to ask you, what is the first characteristic that you notice being similar between an apple and a lime, there are a couple of responses you could give. If you say that they're both green or they're both round, these are perceptions that are tied to the shape and color of the objects that you're perceiving. If you say that they're both fruit, this is a classification perception and considered to be a higher order process. Now, based on the assumption that lower level is necessary for higher order, those who engage in higher order thinking are showing so-called advanced cognitive processing. And one implication of this supposed hierarchy of perception is that this then gets applied to intelligence. Now, I use this example because this very question is posed on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales, or the WAIS, and more points are awarded if people respond with fruit as the answer to this question, which is supposedly indicative of more intelligence. So is so-called lower level processing less complex, less intelligent than the higher level processing? Are there other forms of knowledge? Does higher order processing deserve its status as a marker of intelligence? So it's long been presumed that lower order happens first, and hence the surprising finding that categorical processing brain centers were activated much sooner than anticipated. Indeed, did you need to identify the color and shape of the fruit that you were perceiving in order to give the classification of them as both being fruit? Maybe, maybe not. Given that other research also suggests that higher order can influence the lower level, that is, so-called top-down influences, these studies raise the question of this distinction between higher order and lower level processing. The next set of studies that Michel cites is this distinction between seeing and thinking, where these distinctions are called into question and the order between them. In one of the studies cited, participants are said to, quote, have a visceral sense that doesn't seem to require much thought. For example, how stable that pile of plates is, whether it's going to fall, perhaps how quickly it's going to fall, what direction it's going to fall, end quote, according to Scholl. And in looking at this photo, I found this on Google Images, you don't need a theoretical or conceptual understanding of gravity to know that these dishes are going to fall when the cabinet is opened. You may even instinctively reach out to catch them as the door opens. So this pointed remark about a visceral awareness ties in really nicely with the embodied perspective that we'll consider later on in the course with Merleau-Ponty. Maybe thought isn't an intermediary between myself and the world where the brain, quote, intervenes, interprets, or thinks about the information coming in to then relay this back to the body to make a move or a gesture. Simply by virtue of being a body, we know the world. Bodily, visceral knowing is also a form of knowledge. My body is how I come to know the world around me. To help visualize the next set of studies discussed, take a look at this black and white photo of a rainbow. There are no stripes for the different bands of color. It takes an active perceiver to see the distinct colors. And as evidenced by the difficulty of teaching infants color names, they are still able to see the different bands of color even if they can't name them. The conclusion is that color perception, the ability to see and distinguish between the different colors, is possible without color concepts. This shouldn't be all that surprising. It's possible to do things, use things, even manipulate things without knowing things or their conceptual inner workings. For instance, I don't know how a computer works, but I use one all the time. I can operate a car, but don't ask me to fix it if it breaks down. The argument that makes here is that perception, even lower level processing, is a form of cognition, even if she overstated the degree to which they have, quote, always been conceived of as separate. The next set of studies are ones conducted on mice that explore classical conditioning that reveal supporting neurotransmitter evidence that smells associated with shock can elicit fear. Now, the studies illustrate the interconnectedness of brain regions with the possible conclusion that basic sensory perceptions, that is, the recognition or detection of sensory information without the involvement of higher order processes, is not how perception works, that bottom-up processing doesn't appear to exist, at least for smell, calling into question our long-held belief that bottom-up processing, that we first perceive something and then engage in higher order level cognitive processing, may be faulty. We don't first detect smell, which then activates memory and elicits a fear response as a result. The smell is perceived not just with the olfactory receptors, but other parts of the brain as well. Think about the powerful connection between smells and memories. Do we first detect the smell and think, oh, that reminds me of when X happened? The smell viscerally awakens those memories. The smell is not first perceived and then we go searching through a storehouse of memories, such as that's very similar to this other time I smelled this. The smell is the memory hearkened in us. Cognition is not an intermediary here connecting the perception of a smell to a past memory. Rather, the smell is the memory. There is not a separate smell perceived that's then associated with the cognitive memory. Thus, we might say we smell memories. Memories are smelled. So the notion that there's a lower level sensory perception, much less one that then informs and enables higher order cognitive processes, might be an abstract and after the fact account of how we come to perceive and know the world. The last set of studies considered describes attending to visual stimuli, exploring how we learn to pay attention or not to various visual stimuli. At any given moment, there's a whole host of stimuli that we could be attending to, and most of it we tend to ignore. The results in these studies show that attending to certain stimuli or not is an ongoing process informed by past experiences. Indeed, quote, how cognition shapes what we attend to and how we decide what we attend to, end quote, shows that higher level processes are informing what are deemed lower level processing. Thus, evidence of top-down processing. So to what extent cognition is perception? In other words, are they even distinguishable? Or whether they are distinct but interdependent processes are questions that we'll be pursuing throughout this class. So to review what we've covered so far, the assumption that lower level perception, that is recognition, perceiving color, perceiving shapes, is a necessary first stage that then informs higher level cognitive processing such as classification or memory, has led to three distinct points. The first has been bottom-up processing theories, but as we have seen, there is evidence for top-down processing as well. Thus, the assumption of a one-way directional arrow, assuming that one happens first, is a necessary first step, is called into question by recent studies. There is much more integration and synthesis here and less separation than we've previously thought. The second consequence of this assumption has been the inferences about our intelligence level, and thus blinding us to other forms of knowledge, particularly visceral forms of knowing. The third conclusion has been a separation and distinction between perception and cognition, which maybe overlooks the degree to which they are related. In this class, we'll be considering how we perceive the world, how we think about the world, and how we come to know the world. Now, as you contemplate the questions that we have raised here, I'll leave you with the following quote from Ulrich Neisser, the father of cognitive psychology. He tells us, quote, perception is where cognition and reality meet. We'll take a look at him next week when we consider other theories of perception and cognition. To give you a sense of where we're going, let's take a look at how the class is organized. We'll first consider two theorists who have weighed in on the relationship between perception and cognition. We'll first consider Gibson and his notion of affordances, and then we'll turn next to Neisser. Then we'll turn our attention to the five cardinal senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. That'll take us up to the midterms. Then we'll turn our attention to more complex sensory perceptions, including pain, body, time, distance, space, and we'll finally end the course by discussing synesthesia.